Hello and welcome back. So got something today that is probably going to be met with some groans of disappointment from a few of you, but because last time we looked at the Jura 10-year-old, and I think there's some really surprising positive changes going on with that entry-level Jura, so today I wanted to have a look at another widely available semi-entry level bottling from Jura, and hopefully we can continue with that theme of positive improvement. So this is Jura single malt Scotch whisky 14-year-old American Rye Cask. So first of all, the physical presentation on this one, I really like it. I think that it's a really attractive tube. As always, does a whisky at this price point need a tube or box? Probably not, but they've done it, and it's not too over the top, it's not too wasteful, but probably not necessary. Lovely colour scheme, really eye-catching. As for the bottle, as I said before, I'm a big fan of these Jura bottles. I have been for a long time. I think that they are probably the most ergonomic whisky bottle on the market. Really fits your hand really well. If you're pouring whisky for friends and family, maybe around a campfire or on the beach, this is exactly the sort of thing you want. Such an attractive and functional bottle. As for the label, we'll get around to the actual details on the label in a second, but I think it's a pretty nice label as well. It's smallish, economical with space, gives you a little bit of information, not too much, but I think an attractive presentation. I think they've done a pretty good job there. So addressing the elephant in the room straight away, this one is obviously a Jura whisky that's finished in an American rye cask. And this is fairly unusual that this is a rye finished single malt. Usually cask finishes tend to be something sweet and fruity, and I think that that's not a coincidence. It's an easy way for a distillery to take quite often some young, quite often not particularly great whisky and stick it in a red wine cask or a PX cask or something like that, and it dumps a lot of flavour into the whisky, covers up any sins that are there. Obviously red wine and sherry, especially sherry, have their place in manufacturing of whisky, but I think that a lot of the cask finishes that we see these days are lazy whisky making. And I also think it's a shame that cask finishes kind of make the red wines and the sweet sherries their go-to choice of cask finish these days, because you can see that it makes the whisky sweet and jammy and enjoyable, especially to the casual whisky drinker. But I think that those super sweet cask finishes are very often not the best thing to complement and really highlight the flavours that are in the base spirit already. So even though rye whisky, I must admit, is not one of my favourite styles of whisky, I am hopeful that we'll get something decent out of this rye cask finish, and hopefully we'll get something that really showcases the flavours that are in the whisky already, rather than covering them up. So being a rye cask finish, probably expecting to get some grassy, possibly slightly spicy cereal notes, and perhaps some lemony flavours from that cask finish. Something else that's unusual, especially for the Isle of Jura distillery, is this is a high-ish age statement whisky, but as far as I can see, still not a craft presentation. In fact, I don't think this whisky is craft presented in any way. As for the price point on this one, it's going to be a little bit more expensive than your standard stuff like the 10-year-old from Jura, which kind of seems to be their standard entry-level expression now. Probably a bit more expensive than things like the Journey and perhaps the Sevenwood. I can't remember off the top of my head. But this is definitely not priced entry level, although saying that, if you live in the UK, this is almost certainly one that you're going to see on discount fairly regularly. As for the presentation in this one, it is bottled at the bare legal minimum of 40% ABV, and I don't think there's anything on the label anywhere, but cheeky, if you look at the back of the tube, and I don't know why this isn't on the label, but on the back of the tube, at the bottom, in this green colour on a green background, so it's kind of like they're hiding it from us. But at the bottom it does say, not in English, but it does say Farven Justeret med Caramel mit Farbstoff and in brackets Zucker color. So Zucker color, pardon my pronunciation, is German for sugar color, translated literally. So that's burnt sugar, caramel colouring. It's E150A. So in languages other than German, when they legally are forced to, they are admitting that they've dumped caramel colouring in this one. And as for chill filtration, it's a very dark whiskey, sadly, and it's a very, very clear whiskey. There's no haze to that at all. So being 40% ABV, it's almost certainly chill filtered as well. So a whole list of black marks against this one from Jura before we've even got to taste it. Speaking of which, let's get some in the glass and see what it tastes like. So, cork stopper on this one, reasonably tight fit. It is one of those crappy composite corks. Kind of a ridiculous colour for a whiskey. Obviously, they think that a lot of people don't know any better, or they're going for consistency and they don't give a crap what whiskey drinkers think, but that's not a colour that any experienced whiskey drinker welcomes when they have their dram in the glass. So Jura 14-year-old American Rye Cask on the nose. I'm pleased to say that the cask finish on this one, as I said before, it doesn't do too bad a job of masking the flavours of base spirit. You are getting probably flavours from the base spirit and that rye cask in equal measure. Getting some musty lemon, that's one of the first things that I notice about this one on the nose. So I think that musty lemon is something that I quite often get from rye whiskies, but I also think that some of that musty, slightly farmy peatiness is coming through from the base spirit too. Also a sweet grassiness on the nose, which again I think is coming through from the rye cask and the Jura. So sweet grassiness, a little bit of a hay type aroma. Also a nice little hint of peat on the nose, so more of that vegetal Jura peat that anyone that's familiar with Jura whiskey is going to be instantly familiar with. And I think there's a pleasant salinity on the nose of this one. Not hugely salty, but definitely a salty element to this. Jura in Craighouse on the Isle of Jura. If you've been there, you'll be aware that it is a coastal distillery. Whether or not you believe that the coastal, salty, maritime notes in a whiskey actually come from the sea or not is definitely something that's still open to debate, but I think there's a little bit of that maritime salinity in this whiskey. So overall, on the nose, Jura 14-year-old Rye Cask. I think that it's nice that you've got that musty lemon, you've got that expected grassiness, and you've got some of that Jura peatiness. So all in all, fairly complex, pretty well balanced. It's interesting enough and a very pleasant whiskey to nose. Let's see how it tastes. On the palate of this one thing that does surprise me is it doesn't really seem like a 14-year-old whiskey. If I was tasting this blind, I'd probably guess 10, maybe 12, but probably 10 years old, something like that. I think that it has a similar level of maturity to the Jura 10-year-old. But what you are getting on the palate of this one, some more of that salty, vegetal Jura-style peat. There's some faintly smoky caramel notes, slightly fudgy, caramelly, as well as some sweet bourbon notes, kind of matching those bourbon rye notes that we got on the nose. A little bit of a spicy oakiness to the palate of this one, as well as some faint berry and dark fruits notes. And I'm kind of unsure as to whether those berry, dark fruit, spicy notes are coming from the rye cask or just from those fresh American oak casks. I think probably a little bit of a combination of the two. As for the finish on this one, medium long, could be better, could be worse, lots of sweet caramel and a pleasant dry grassiness. So all in all, I think this is a very nice little As I said, semi-entry level whiskey, and I really like that you're getting that clear influence from the rye casks, but also with that Jura DNA still intact. As I said before, it doesn't really smell or taste to me like a mid-teens whiskey, but I do think that it's mature enough for the price point that this is going to be selling at. I think that it's really what you would expect if you've had the Jura 10-year-old. Imagine that, but you replace the sherry influence that you've got on the 10-year-old with those rye casks, and it's really what you would expect. Absolutely no surprises here, and I think it's decent stuff if you find it for a good price. But, and there's a but coming, you know there is, it really should have been 46%. And while we're talking about that, should have been natural colour and unchill filtered as well, because why not? I think that this is another whiskey from Jura that's really a big improvement. It's a big step up from, quite honestly, the crap that they have given us over the last few years. It's a really decent, honest, fairly recommendable whiskey. And I think it's the shame that they couldn't give us that craft presentation, that 46% non-chill filtration, to really do justice to the age and the much improved spirit that they're putting into this. As for a grade on this one, I'm going to go with a C+, which is the same grade that I gave to the Jura 10-year-old, because really I think that not that much has changed. You've kind of added some things and taken other things away. You've ended up with a Jura whiskey, which is really a variation on the theme of that standard 10-year-old, with the quality of experience not really increased or decreased. It's certainly a different experience compared to the 10-year-old, but I think that what they've changed on this one, it doesn't really make it stand out above or below the experience that you get with the 10. Certainly recommendable though. It's an enjoyable little whiskey if you get it at a good price. And it's a perfectly acceptable and enjoyable little whiskey, especially if you like your American whiskies, and especially if you like rye whiskies. So a decent whiskey to try if you find it at a good price. Thanks for watching, and cheers.